I set the dining table slowly, smoothing each napkin as if perfection could make the evening different this year. Christmas had always been a stage where I played the quiet background role, offering dishes, laughing softly, and letting others' conversations swallow mine. Still, a part of me hoped that maybe, just maybe, tonight I'd be seen. This is just the start of our family story. Tell me where you are watching from. The scent of roasted turkey curled through the kitchen, warm and comforting, but my thoughts snagged on something colder. Days ago, I'd caught my nephew hunched over my phone, his thumb moving too quickly, his smirk too familiar. At first, I thought it was harmless curiosity. But later, when I found what he had sent, messages mocking me, twisting my words, it felt like a hand closing around my chest. Now, as candles flickered against polished silverware, I knew the meal would not unfold as planned. What he had stolen from me, I was about to return tenfold. So let's get into what happened after that night when I discovered my nephew scrolling through my phone. The image is still sharp in my mind. His head bent low, his hair falling into his eyes, the faint glow of the screen lighting his face. He didn't see me standing there in the doorway. I remember watching in silence, half expecting him to stop, half hoping I was wrong, but he didn't stop. His thumb kept moving quickly, and then he let out a little laugh, the kind of laugh that only comes when someone thinks they're getting away with something. I didn't say anything then. Instead, I stepped back quietly, heart pressing against my ribs in a strange rhythm. There are moments when confrontation feels too small for the weight of what you've just learned, and this was one of them. My phone wasn't just an object. It was a piece of me. My pictures, my saved notes, my messages, private things I never intended anyone else to see. To know he had gone through it, not with innocence, but with the intent to mock me later, left me unsettled in a way I couldn't shake. When I opened my messages later, I saw the evidence. Texts I hadn't written, words that twisted simple things into jokes at my expense, sent to his friends. Oh, it felt less like a prank and more like an unveiling. My own family member peeling back the curtain, using my trust as the punchline. For years, I'd been patient, letting comments slip, letting myself fade into the background at gatherings. But that night, staring at the screen, I realized patience had turned into silence, and silence had turned into permission. I lay awake thinking about it. The Christmas dinner was coming up, and part of me wanted to just let it go, to avoid the waves that would surely crash if I spoke up. But another part of me, the part that had been stepped over too many times, couldn't bear the thought of sitting at that table again, smiling as though nothing had happened. I thought about all the little moments, the dismissive comments, the way he sometimes mimicked my words when he thought I wasn't listening. None of it had stung quite like this because now he had crossed into a place that was mine alone. The idea came to me in the quiet, sometime after midnight. I could print them, every single one of those messages he had sent. Lay them out in ink, undeniable, stripped of the shrugging excuses he would throw up if I confronted him in private. It wasn't about shaming him, it was about forcing the truth into the light where everyone could see it. He had used my own phone to speak in my name, so I would use his words to speak in his. In the days leading up to Christmas, I carried that secret with me like a folded piece of paper in my pocket. At work, I found myself drifting in thought, rehearsing what I might say when the moment came. At the grocery store, while I picked out cranberries and flour, I pictured my family's faces as they read the words. A part of me felt guilty, almost as if I were plotting something too heavy for a holiday meant for warmth. But another part of me felt stronger than I had in years. I wasn't planning revenge. I was planning truth. When I went to the print shop, I almost laughed at how mundane the process was. The man behind the counter didn't know what he was giving me. Just sheets of paper, ink pressed into thin lines. But to me, it was like carrying proof of something that had always lived under the surface. The disrespect, the dismissal, the quiet cruelty. Each page carried his words, not mine. And that distinction mattered. At home, I sat at the kitchen table, smoothing the stack with my hands. I placed each one in a plain envelope. Sealing them carefully, I thought about writing names across the front. Mother, father, uncle, aunt, but decided against it. No, they would all see at the same time. No one would feel singled out, and no one would pretend not to know. When the moment came, I would simply hand them out, one by one, like invitations to a truth that had waited long enough. There were moments I nearly wavered. My sister called me 2 nights before Christmas, her voice cheerful as she asked me to bring my apple pie. She didn't know what else I was bringing. I almost told her then, almost gave away the plan, but something inside told me to stay quiet. She had always been quick to dismiss my concerns, brushing things off as if I were overly sensitive. Well, if I told her now, she would find a way to make me feel small again. No, it had to be revealed in the moment, in front of them all. Christmas Eve, I placed the envelopes in my bag, tucking them between gifts wrapped in red and gold paper. No one would notice them there. I checked twice, making sure they were secure, and then I poured myself a glass of wine. The tree glowed softly in the corner, lights reflecting off the ornaments I'd collected over the years. For a moment, I felt the weight of what I was about to do. It wasn't just about a phone. It wasn't even just about him. It was about years of silence, years of letting myself be the shadow in the room. I thought of my father then, how he used to tell me that truth has a way of showing itself when you least expect it. I never believed him fully until that week, because now the truth wasn't knocking. It was printed, folded, sealed, and ready to be handed out like a gift no one had asked for, but everyone needed to receive. As I turned off the lights and headed to bed, I realized something unexpected. I wasn't nervous anymore. I was ready. When I think about why this cut so deeply, it isn't only about my nephew pressing his fingers across my phone screen. It reaches further back into a long pattern that has followed me through family gatherings like a shadow at my heels. I've spent most of my adult life being the one who was reliable but rarely recognized, steady but rarely celebrated. That night, staring at those printed words, I realized he was only echoing something he had already learned from the rest of them. At family dinners, I was often the person who brought the side dishes no one noticed. The person who helped clean up quietly in the kitchen while everyone else lingered around the fire. My siblings had strong personalities. They filled the air with stories, debates, and opinions that drowned out softer voices. I told myself I didn't mind, that it was better to avoid conflict and let them take the spotlight. But small things add up over years. The teasing that seemed harmless, the way decisions were made without me, even the simple fact that they never asked what was new in my life. My nephew had grown up in that environment. He had learned that my role was to be tolerated, not respected. When I caught him with my phone, it was like seeing the next generation carry forward the same indifference. Except his version came with technology, with jokes written into text threads and shared with friends I'd never met. His smirk that night wasn't born in isolation. It was born in the years of watching the family brush me aside. I thought back to a moment years ago, one I hadn't revisited in a long time. My sister had called me in a panic because their mortgage payment had slipped through the cracks. She begged me not to tell anyone, not to mention it at family events. I lent her the money without hesitation. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to stop the bank from knocking. She promised she'd pay me back, and she did. But what stayed with me wasn't the money, it was the secrecy. No one else ever knew. And when I saw her husband bragging at Christmas about how well they managed their finances, I sat in silence. That had been the beginning of me realizing how easily I was used as a safety net, but never honored as one. This wasn't the only instance. I've paid for college books quietly, slipped gas money into envelopes, sat through long phone calls where I was more listener than sibling. Each time, I told myself this was what family did. But the silence after, the absence of acknowledgement, was its own form of erasure. My nephew's mocking messages only tore open that old wound. He might not have known about all I'd done, but he had inherited the tone, the dismissal, the laugh at my expense. So when I stood in that print shop watching the man feed the sheets through the machine, I wasn't just thinking about text messages. I was thinking about all the years of letting things slide, about the way invisibility can weigh more heavily than conflict. I wondered if they would ever see me differently, or if I was destined to remain the dependable relative in the corner, quietly holding things together while everyone else performed their lives loudly. The envelopes in my bag became something larger than evidence. They became a statement. They said, I am here and I will not be spoken for anymore. It was not the kind of gift anyone expected at Christmas, but it was the only one that mattered to me. In the days that followed, I kept picturing his face when he would realize what I had done. Part of me worried it would break him in a way I didn't intend. After all, he was still young, still learning who he was. But then another thought struck me. What if no one ever stopped him? What if he grew into adulthood believing it was acceptable to treat others like this? What if, one day, he scrolled through his own child's phone and didn't even see the irony? That was the moment I stopped questioning whether I should go through with it. It wasn't about punishment. It was about clarity. Sometimes the only way to teach someone is to let them hear their own words spoken back at them. Still, the weight of what I carried wasn't easy. At night, I'd lie awake and imagine every possible reaction. My brother might laugh it off, brushing aside the seriousness as just kids being kids. My sister might grow defensive, accusing me of embarrassing her son instead of addressing what he had done. Others might stare at their plates in silence, unwilling to get involved. I'd been in that silence many times before, and I knew how it burned. But if it came again, this time it would not be mine. One evening before the dinner, I laid out the envelopes on my table and stared at them side by side. Plain white. Ordinary. If a stranger saw them, they would mean nothing. But inside was the key to shifting the balance that had been off for years. I touched the flap of one envelope and thought of my father again, his steady voice telling me that truth doesn't always shout. It sometimes whispers until you can no longer ignore it. These weren't whispers anymore. They were written in bold letters, ready to be read aloud without my voice breaking. By the time Christmas morning came, my plan was steady inside me. I wrapped my pie in foil, packed the envelopes beneath the gifts, and drove through quiet streets lined with frosted roofs. My hand stayed steady on the wheel. For once, I wasn't walking into a family gathering feeling smaller than the rest. I was carrying something they couldn't deny, something that belonged not just to me, but to the truth we'd all pretended not to see. Driving up my sister's long driveway that Christmas afternoon, I could feel the weight of the envelopes in my bag, even though they hardly weighed anything at all. The house was already glowing with lights, cars lined along the curb, and laughter spilling out through the windows. I parked, sat there for a moment with my hands on the steering wheel, and told myself that this year, I would not leave feeling invisible. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of cinnamon and cloves. My sister greeted me with a smile, but I noticed the quick glance at the pie dish in my hands, checking, as she always did, that I had brought what she expected. I handed it over without comment and slipped my coat off, my other hand still brushing against the strap of the bag where the envelopes waited. The living room was loud already, children chasing each other, my brothers arguing over football scores, my nephew on the couch with his phone glowing in his hand. He barely looked up when I came in, and I felt that sting of dismissal again. It would have been easy to shrink back into my usual role, to slide quietly into a chair at the edge of the room. But this time, I held on to my purpose. As the evening wore on, I let myself drift through conversations, though half my mind was elsewhere. I thought about last year's Christmas when my nephew had mimicked my way of speaking at the dinner table, earning laughs from the others. I'd smiled along back then, though later I had sat in my car fighting back tears. I thought about birthdays when my gifts were treated like afterthoughts, compared to the flashier presents from others. All those moments lived inside me, each one a reminder of how easily my presence was brushed aside. The memory that surfaced most vividly, though, was from years before. It was Thanksgiving, and I had brought a dessert I'd spent hours making from scratch. No one touched it. My nephew, still small then, wrinkled his nose and whispered to his cousin that it looked strange. Everyone laughed, and my sister quickly moved the dish to the sideboard where it stayed untouched all night. I'd gone home with it still intact, sliding it into my fridge and telling myself it didn't matter. But it had mattered. Each small cut had added up. And now here we were. I glanced at my nephew again. He was laughing with his friends over something on his phone, fingers flying as he typed. For a moment, I wondered if he was mocking me again right there in that room. The thought hardened my resolve. It wasn't just about exposing him, it was about refusing to accept this role I'd been given in our family narrative. Later, while helping my sister in the kitchen, she asked if I'd remembered to bring extra whipped cream. I hadn't, and she sighed, muttering that she should have reminded me. It was such a small thing, but it landed heavily. She always assumed I needed reminding that I couldn't handle responsibility the way others did. I bit back the urge to defend myself, knowing that soon my actions would speak louder than any words. After dessert, the family settled into the living room. Wrapping paper still littered the floor, lights from the tree reflecting off crumpled ribbons. I reached into my bag and touched the stack of envelopes. My heart beat faster, but my hands were steady. I reminded myself that this wasn't about cruelty, it was about truth. I waited for a lull in the chatter. My nephew leaned back on the couch, scrolling again, oblivious. The moment felt right. I stood up, the envelopes tucked against my palm, and cleared my throat. The sound wasn't loud, but it cut through enough to draw a few eyes. Before we finish the evening, I said, I'd like to share something with everyone. Heads turned. My sister frowned, sensing something in my tone. My nephew finally looked up, confusion flashing across his face. I didn't waver. I walked slowly around the room, handing out an envelope to each person. The rustle of paper filled the silence as they opened them, one by one. I watched their expressions shift. Surprise, then discomfort, then the first traces of recognition. My nephew's face drained of color as he realized what they were reading. His own words, captured on the page, mocking me, mocking the family, mocking things that should never have been turned into jokes. No one spoke at first. The silence was heavy, broken only by the crackle of the fire. My nephew shifted uncomfortably, his phone sliding from his hand onto the couch. My sister's mouth tightened, her eyes flicking between him and me. My brothers looked down at the pages, then up at him, then at each other. I stayed standing, calm, waiting. It was not my place to explain. The words explained themselves. The silence after everyone finished reading felt longer than it probably was. No one moved, as though shifting in their seats might make the weight of the words heavier. My nephew's face was flushed, his shoulders hunched as if he could sink into the couch and disappear. I stayed standing, steady, letting the room absorb what was in their hands. My sister was the first to break the stillness. "What is this?" she asked, though her voice wasn't filled with curiosity. It was sharp, demanding, as though she already knew the answer and hated that it was being laid bare in front of everyone. "They're his messages," I said simply. "The ones he sent from my phone." Her eyes shot toward her son. He opened his mouth, closed it again, then stammered something about it being a joke. The words sounded weak, fragile against the paper that lay on every lap. One of my brothers let out a low whistle, shaking his head slowly. "This is bad," he muttered. "Really bad." I felt my hands relax at my sides. For once, the truth wasn't lodged in my throat. It wasn't me trying to convince anyone of something they didn't want to believe. It was right there in front of them, undeniable. My nephew finally found his voice. "It was just for fun," he said, his tone climbing higher, defensive. "Everyone jokes around. You're making it into something it's not." But the room wasn't on his side anymore. I could see it in the way my brothers looked at him, in the way my sister's jaw tightened. The words on those pages had turned laughter into silence. He had mocked more than just me. He had poked at family secrets, mimicked habits, reduced serious matters into punchlines. He had thought it was all invisible, locked away in the safety of private threads. Now it was exposed under the glow of the Christmas lights. I could have spoken then, could have told him how it felt to discover his words, how years of small slights had led to this moment. But I didn't. The silence was more powerful than any lecture I could give. It forced him to sit with his choices, forced the family to sit with what they had ignored for too long. Finally, my sister spoke again. Her voice was low now, stripped of its earlier bite. Did you really send all this? He nodded reluctantly, eyes fixed on the floor. The quiet stretched, broken only by the fire popping in the hearth. I looked around the room at faces I had known all my life, and for once, I didn't feel like the background character. I felt like the one holding the ground beneath us steady. The evening carried on, though nothing felt the same. Conversations were cautious, clipped. My nephew avoided my gaze, his phone untouched beside him. I sat quietly listening, letting the shift settle. There was no triumph in it, only a kind of calm I hadn't felt before. Later, as dishes were cleared and coats gathered, my sister pulled me aside in the hallway. Her face was pale, eyes tired. You could have handled that differently, she whispered. I met her gaze. So could he. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, her lips pressing into a thin line. For once, she didn't have a ready dismissal, no quick excuse to push my feelings aside. That silence between us said more than any argument could. Driving home that night, the streets dark and quiet, I thought about everything that had unfolded. The envelopes had done their work, but it wasn't about humiliating him. It was about refusing to let myself be erased again. Well, he had crossed a line and I had drawn one in return. What surprised me most was how steady I felt. No shaking hands on the wheel, no second guessing. For the first time in years, I felt seen. And that, more than anything, was the real gift of the night. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual, the quiet of my house settling around me like a reminder that the night before had actually happened. I lay in bed for a while, staring at the ceiling, letting the details of Christmas dinner replay in my mind. The room full of startled faces, the silence that followed, my nephew's hunched posture, my sister's whispered rebuke in the hallway. It had been a long time since I'd left a family gathering without feeling small. And though I wasn't celebrating, I also wasn't carrying the familiar weight of regret. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I had sealed those envelopes just days earlier. The stack was gone now, dispersed into the hands of the people who needed to see them most. I wondered what they had done with them, tucked them away, thrown them out, read them again in private. I doubted anyone would bring it up soon, but I knew it wasn't something they could easily forget. By afternoon, my phone buzzed with a message. It was from my brother, the quieter one who often avoided family conflicts. He wrote, "You were right to do it. It needed to be said." Just 6 words, but I read them over and over, each time feeling a little steadier. For years, I had been the one on the outside, and now, even in a small way, someone had stood next to me. Later that day, my nephew sent a message too. It wasn't an apology, at least not in the way I would have wanted. "Did you have to make it so public?" he asked. I stared at the screen for a long time before replying. "If you'd kept it private, I would have too." It was the truth, plain and unpolished. He didn't respond. The days that followed were quiet, but not in the same way they usually were after holidays. I wasn't carrying bitterness into the new year. Instead, I felt something unfamiliar. Peace. I went about my routines, cleaned up the leftover decorations, stored away the ornaments. Each task felt like clearing space not just in my house, but in myself. Still, memories lingered. I thought about the years of small humiliations, how often I had chosen silence to keep the peace. It struck me that silence hadn't kept anything at peace at all. It had only kept me invisible. My nephew's actions had forced me to choose differently this time, and in a strange way, I almost felt grateful. Not for what he had done, but for the push it had given me to finally speak in a language that couldn't be ignored. One evening, as I sat reading by the lamp, the phone rang. It was my sister. For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail, but I answered. Her voice was hesitant, stripped of its usual certainty. "I've been thinking about what happened," she said. I waited. "You embarrassed him," she added, but her tone wasn't accusing. It sounded more like she was trying to process it aloud. "He embarrassed himself," I replied. "I just made sure no one could pretend otherwise." Silence stretched between us. Then, more softly, she said, I didn't realize how much you felt pushed aside. I almost laughed at that because how could she not know? But I swallowed it back. You didn't want to realize, I said instead. There was no argument this time. Only a long pause followed by a quiet, maybe you're right. After we hung up, I sat in the stillness, the weight of her words circling in my mind. Maybe you're right. They weren't an apology, not fully, but they cracked open a space where one could live someday. The following week, I visited a friend for lunch. She had known pieces of my family story for years, the frustrations I rarely voiced but couldn't entirely hide. I told her about Christmas, about the envelopes, about the silence that had followed. She leaned back in her chair, smiling faintly. You finally stood up for yourself, she said. That's not cruelty, that's survival. Her words settled into me like stones grounding me in place. For years, I had equated standing up for myself with being unkind, as though drawing a line was the same as burning a bridge. But maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was simply refusing to let others decide who I was. Driving home, I thought about my nephew again. I wondered if he would remember that night years from now, when he was older, when he had children of his own. Would he remember the shame on his face? Would he remember the way the room turned against him? Would he remember me standing silently while his words spoke louder than anything I could have said? I hoped he would. Not to punish him, but to remind him of what it meant to be careless with another person's dignity. By the time the new year arrived, I felt different. Not transformed overnight, but shifted in a way that couldn't be undone. My nephew had tried to make me the butt of a joke, but in the end, he had written the story of his own undoing. And I finally had stepped into the center of the room. In the weeks that followed, the echoes of Christmas dinner lingered longer than I expected. I thought people might bury the incident, fold it away like one of those crumpled ribbons from the gift exchange, but instead it seemed to keep resurfacing in quiet ways. My brother called me twice just to check in, something he had never done before. He didn't bring up the envelopes directly, but there was something softer in his voice, an acknowledgement beneath the small talk. My nephew, on the other hand, avoided me. At a family gathering in early January, he barely looked at me. He spent most of the evening in the corner, fiddling with his phone, though this time it was more like a shield than a weapon. I noticed how his laughter was shorter, forced even, and how he seemed more careful about when he spoke. It struck me that the message had reached him after all, though maybe not in the way he had imagined. My sister's tone with me shifted too, though it was less direct. She asked my opinion more often when we were in the same room about meals or plans, as if testing the waters. It wasn't an apology, but it was a start, and I took it for what it was. After years of being dismissed, even the smallest acknowledgement felt like air filling a space I had almost forgotten existed. One evening, I found myself sitting at my kitchen table again, the old oak table my father had built decades ago. He had shaped it by hand, sanding the surface smooth, carving small notches along the edges to give it a sense of strength. We had eaten countless meals on it, argued over it, celebrated birthdays and holidays around it. Now it stood as the silent witness to my own small revolution. I ran my fingers along the grooves, thinking about how many times I had sat here, silencing myself. The table hadn't changed, but I had. I wondered what my father would have thought of what I had done. He had been a man of few words, someone who believed actions told the real story. I imagined him nodding quietly, not needing to say much, just understanding. That thought steadied me. By February, things had begun to settle into a new rhythm. Family dinners were less tense, though the memory of Christmas hovered at the edges. My nephew still carried himself differently. Once I caught him watching me, as though he wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. I didn't push him. Lessons sometimes take time to bloom, and forcing them only makes them wither. Still, there were moments when I questioned whether I had gone too far. Had I shamed him in a way that would harden rather than teach? Late at night, those doubts would stir, but then I would remember the years of silence, the way each small slight had accumulated until my voice felt unnecessary even to myself. The envelopes weren't about humiliation, they were about restoration. At work, a colleague I'd known for years commented that I seemed different, more sure of yourself, she said. I laughed, surprised. But later, driving home, I realized she was right. Something in me had shifted, not just within the family, but everywhere. I carried myself differently, not louder, but clearer, as if I had finally decided that my presence mattered. By spring, the story had become more of a memory, though one that still held weight. My nephew finally spoke to me directly one afternoon when I stopped by my sister's house. He stood in the doorway, awkward, his voice lower than I remembered. "I shouldn't have gone through your phone," he said, "and I shouldn't have sent those things." It wasn't elaborate, but it was honest. I nodded, meeting his eyes. "Thank you for saying that." He shifted, looking down at his shoes. I just, I didn't think anyone cared what I wrote. It was stupid. "It mattered," I said. "Words always matter." For the first time, I saw him really hear me. It was as though the ground between us had shifted. Not perfectly, but enough to start again. That night, back at my kitchen table, I thought about how justice doesn't always come in grand gestures. Sometimes it comes in small acknowledgments, in the quiet turning of a page. The envelopes had been dramatic, yes, but what they left behind was more subtle. A new space for me to exist as myself without apology. And that, I realized, was all I had ever wanted. So let's get into how everything finally came together in the months after Christmas, because the aftermath carried a weight of its own. By the time summer rolled around, the story of what happened at that dinner had become part of family memory, the kind of thing that no one directly mentioned but everyone silently carried. Gatherings felt different, not hostile but cautious, as though people were learning how to treat me in ways they had never bothered to before. At Easter, I noticed it most. We sat around another crowded table, ham and casseroles steaming in the center, and for the first time, someone asked me to lead the prayer. It was my brother's wife, her voice casual but sincere. I hesitated for a moment because it had never been me before. My sister usually took that role, or one of the older cousins. But everyone bowed their heads and waited, so I spoke. It was short, steady, not rehearsed, but afterward I realized my hands hadn't shaken. My nephew sat across from me that day. He was quieter, more thoughtful. When I caught his eye, he didn't look away this time. There was no smirk, no shrug, just recognition, simple and clear. It wasn't forgiveness, and it didn't need to be. What mattered was that the dynamic between us had shifted. He had seen me stand in a way he hadn't expected, and it left its mark. One afternoon in July, I went over to help my sister with some yard work. She had called me, something she rarely did unless she needed a hand. We trimmed hedges together, the sun hot on our backs, and for the first hour, conversation stayed shallow. But then she set down her clippers and said, "I've been thinking about that night." I wiped sweat from my forehead, waiting. "You were right," she said. "I was angry at you for embarrassing him, but I should have been angry at him for doing it in the first place." I let out a slow breath. Hearing those words felt like a door opening, one I'd been pushing against for years. "I know I haven't always been fair to you," she added, looking down at the ground. "You've done more for this family than anyone knows, and I guess I didn't want to see it." I nodded, not rushing to fill the silence. She needed to say it, and I needed to hear it. When she finally met my eyes again, it wasn't the same look of dismissal I'd grown used to. It was softer, edged with something that might even grow into respect. That night, back at home, I sat at my father's table again. The wood was worn now, scratches from years of use cutting across its surface. I ran my hand over them, thinking about the journey from that December to this moment. The envelopes had been bold, yes, but what mattered more was what they set in motion. They made space for conversations that had never existed before. They forced honesty where silence had ruled. When autumn came, I hosted a small dinner of my own. It wasn't grand, just a few dishes laid out with care. My siblings and their families crowded into my house for the first time in years. I noticed how people helped without being asked, how my sister praised the food, how my nephew carried plates back to the kitchen without being told. Small shifts, but they mattered. Later that evening, after everyone had gone, I stood in the quiet of my house and felt something I hadn't felt before in relation to my family: balance. Not perfection, not reconciliation in some storybook sense, but balance. I was no longer the one left on the margins. My voice had carved its place and it had stayed. Looking back, I realized that Christmas dinner had never been about revenge. It had been about restoring something in me that had been worn down over years. My nephew's mistake had cracked open the truth, and I had chosen not to bury it again. And in doing so, I had finally stepped out from the background I had been placed in for far too long. That was the gift I gave myself, and it was the one no one could take away.